Mute, the Silent Hiker, Story of Confession and Terror audio short horror story. Chapter 1, The Betrayal. Durban was the kind of town where shadows lingered a little longer than they should, and the air always carried a hint of something unsaid. The streets, lined with aging oaks and weathered houses, held on to their secrets with a stubborn grip. It was in one of these houses, tucked away at the end of Maple Street, where Monette lived. A house that had once been filled with warmth, but now seemed as hollow as his marriage. Monette stood by the window in the master bedroom, staring out at the line of trees that bordered his property. Those woods, dense and ancient, seemed to encroach a little more each year, as if they were trying to reclaim the land. He'd often joked to Elena about the trees creeping closer, but now the sight of them made him feel uneasy. There was something oppressive about their silent, watchful presence. But it wasn't the trees that troubled Monette this morning. It was the knowledge that had slithered into his life just 2 days prior, wrapping itself around his heart like a constrictor. He had found the evidence in the most mundane of places, a series of text messages on Elena's phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter. The words, though few, had been enough to confirm what he had suspected for months. His wife, the woman he had shared a life with for nearly a decade, was unfaithful. A bitter taste settled on his tongue as he replayed the discovery in his mind. He had confronted her the night before, his voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Elena, usually so poised, had been caught off guard. Her denial was weak, almost as if she knew it wouldn't hold. And then, she had simply retreated into silence, leaving Monette to grapple with the jagged shards of their broken relationship. Now, as he dressed in the dim morning light, Monette felt the weight of that silence pressing down on him. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of floorboards. Elena was downstairs, probably sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring into space as she had done so many times before. It was a ritual she had adopted in the last few months, a retreat into her own thoughts where Monette could no longer reach her. He tightened his tie, the routine action grounding him in the present. Today was important, an opportunity that could change everything. The business deal he was about to negotiate had the potential to elevate his career to new heights. But as much as he tried to focus on the upcoming meeting, his mind kept circling back to Elena, to the betrayal that had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. Monette closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. He needed to keep it together, to bury the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. There would be time to deal with Elena later. For now, he had to play the part of the composed, unflappable businessman, a role he had perfected over the years. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended, the sound echoing in the quiet house. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the hallway, mingling with the faint scent of rain that seeped in from the open window. Monette found Elena in the kitchen, just as he had imagined. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes distant and unfocused. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. He hesitated in the doorway. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat. What was there to say, really? The trust that had once bound them together was gone, shredded by lies and deceit. Yet part of him wanted to lash out, to force her to speak, to explain how they had come to this. Instead, he simply cleared his throat. Elena looked up, her expression unreadable. There was a time when he could decipher every thought, every emotion that flickered across her face. But now, she was a stranger to him, a woman with secrets he no longer had access to. "I'm heading out," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "The meeting? It's important." Elena nodded, but the gesture felt mechanical, as if she were barely present. Monette waited, hoping for something, an apology, an explanation, anything to break the unbearable silence. But she said nothing, her gaze dropping back to the mug in her hands. A cold anger twisted in his gut, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. He turned on his heel and left the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps sharp in the quiet. The front door closed behind him with a finality that made his heart ache. Outside, the air was cool and damp, the sky overcast and heavy with the promise of rain. Monette paused on the porch, taking in the sight of the woods that loomed on the edge of his property. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment, he felt as if they were watching him, waiting. With a shake of his head, Monette pushed the thought away and made his way to the car. The day ahead was full of possibilities, but the shadow of Elena's betrayal hung over him like a dark cloud. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be free of it. Chapter 2: The Hitchhiker. The narrow back roads of Durban snaked through the dense forest, twisting and turning like the gnarled roots of the ancient trees that flanked them. As Monette drove, the world outside his car seemed to close in, the towering pines and oaks forming a dark, oppressive tunnel. The overcast sky, heavy with low-hanging clouds, did little to dispel the gloom. The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more isolated he felt, as if the town of Durban was a distant memory, fading in the rearview mirror. Monette's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the knuckles white with tension. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound, a monotonous drone that matched the emptiness gnawing at his insides. He had hoped the drive would clear his mind, give him a chance to put some distance between himself and the poisonous thoughts swirling in his head. But the silence in the car was too loud, amplifying every doubt, every fear, until it became unbearable. The road ahead stretched out like an endless ribbon, lined with trees that seemed to twist and contort in unnatural ways. Monette caught glimpses of their branches through the fog that had begun to roll in, tendrils of mist creeping across the pavement like ghostly fingers. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't say why. He was a man of logic, of reason, but there was something about the woods in Durban that felt wrong. He shook his head, trying to banish the unsettling thoughts. There was no room for distractions, not today. The business meeting was crucial, a make-or-break moment in his career. Yet, despite his best efforts, his mind kept drifting back to Elena, to the betrayal that had shattered the fragile equilibrium of his life. The fog thickened as he rounded a bend, and that's when he saw him, a lone figure standing by the roadside, half shrouded in the mist. Monette's foot hovered over the brake, instinct urging him to slow down. The man was tall and thin, almost skeletal in appearance, with a head of unruly hair that framed a face obscured by shadows. He was dressed in dark, weathered clothing, the kind that seemed more suited to the previous century than this one. Monette hesitated, his better judgment screaming at him to keep driving. Picking up a hitchhiker in these desolate woods was the last thing he should do. But something about the man's stillness, his eerie silence, drew Monette in, as if there were an invisible force compelling him to stop. The car rolled to a halt, the engine idling as Monette leaned over and cranked down the passenger window. The hitchhiker didn't move, didn't even flinch, as if he had been expecting Monette all along. For a moment, they stared at each other through the fog, two strangers connected by a thread of fate neither could see. "Need a ride?" Monette called out, his voice breaking the spell of silence that hung between them. The hitchhiker nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down Monette's spine. He opened the passenger door and slid into the seat without a word, his movements smooth and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Monette glanced at the man out of the corner of his eye as he pulled back onto the road. The hitchhiker sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, staring straight ahead. There was an unsettling calmness about him, a quiet that seemed to suck the air out of the car. "Where are you headed?" Monette asked, trying to fill the void with something, anything, that would break the tension. The hitchhiker didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. Monette felt a flicker of irritation, but quickly pushed it aside. Maybe the man was just one of those types who preferred not to talk. Or maybe he had his reasons for staying silent. Either way, Monette figured he could use the quiet to gather his thoughts, to clear his mind before the meeting. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the fog-drenched woods. Monette kept his eyes on the road, but the silence began to weigh on him, pressing down on his chest like a heavy stone. He needed to speak, to release the pent-up frustration that had been building since he left the house. "Elena's been having an affair," Monette said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The hitchhiker gave no sign of having heard, but Monette pressed on, the floodgates of his mind now wide open. I found out a couple of days ago. She didn't even deny it, just sat there, staring at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. The hitchhiker's silence was unnerving, but Monette found it strangely liberating. There was no judgment, no empty platitudes, just the steady rhythm of the car and the thickening fog outside. I should have seen it coming, Monette continued, his voice growing harsher with each word. We've been drifting apart for years, but I was too focused on work to notice, too busy building a life that she apparently wanted nothing to do with. Now, all I have left is this business meeting, and even that feels hollow. He glanced over at the hitchhiker, expecting, hoping for some kind of reaction. But the man remained as still as a statue, his face unreadable in the dim light of the car's interior. Monette felt a flicker of unease but quickly brushed it aside. He needed to vent, and the hitchhiker's silence was as good a sounding board as any. "I'm not even sure why I'm telling you this," Monette said, more to himself than to his passenger. "Maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe I'm hoping that if I say it out loud, it'll start to make sense. But it doesn't. None of it does." The fog outside the car grew thicker, swallowing the road ahead in a swirling sea of gray. Monette slowed the car, squinting to make out the path through the dense mist. The trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "You ever feel like the world is just closing in on you?" Monette asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The hitchhiker's silence was the only answer he received. Monette let out a heavy sigh, the weight of the past few days finally crashing down on him. He felt tired, bone deep, soul-crushingly tired, as if the betrayal had drained the life out of him, leaving behind only a hollow shell of the man he once was. The car continued its slow crawl through the fog, with the road ahead disappearing into the thick, impenetrable mist. Monette's thoughts drifted, the words he had spoken lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. The hitchhiker's presence, though silent, was a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root in his life. And in that silence, in the absence of words, Monette began to realize that the man's silence might be more dangerous than anything he could have said. Chapter 3: The Confession. The road twisted like a serpent through the heart of the forest, its curves sharp and unforgiving. As the car crept deeper into the woods, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the world outside in a swirling, ghostly haze. The headlights cut feeble beams through the mist, revealing nothing but the encroaching darkness ahead. The trees on either side loomed tall and ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Inside the car, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air felt thick, almost tangible, pressing down on Monette with a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. The hitchhiker remained silent, his presence an eerie, unsettling void that sucked the warmth from the air. Monette could feel the man's gaze, even though the hitchhiker's eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking and unseeing. Monette's thoughts were a tangled mess, swirling like the fog outside, and he found himself speaking again, almost against his will. The silence in the car demanded to be filled, and Monette's words spilled out like a confession in a confessional booth. "You know, it's not just Elena who's been unfaithful," Monette began, his voice low and strained. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that have haunted me for years." The hitchhiker didn't react, didn't so much as flinch, but Monette could feel the tension in the air tighten, as if the man's silence was drawing the truth out of him, coaxing it from the dark corners of his mind where it had been buried for so long. "I had an affair," Monette continued, the words heavy on his tongue. "It wasn't planned, it just happened. I was on a business trip, alone in a city where no one knew me. I met someone, a woman, and one thing led to another. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, just a mistake I could forget, but it wasn't. It happened again and again." He paused, glancing at the hitchhiker, hoping for some reaction, some sign that he was listening. But the man's silence was absolute, a void that swallowed Monette's words whole. The fog outside thickened, reducing visibility to a few feet in front of the car. The world beyond the windshield was nothing but a swirling mass of gray, the road barely discernible beneath it. "I told myself it didn't matter," Monette said, his voice cracking. I convinced myself that what Elena didn't know wouldn't hurt her, but it did matter. It mattered more than I ever admitted to myself. It's been eating away at me, gnawing at my insides like a disease. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unbearable. Monette could feel it wrapping around him like a shroud, suffocating him with his own guilt. The hitchhiker's presence, once merely unsettling, now felt malevolent, as if the man's very silence was a judgment, a silent condemnation that forced Monette to confront the truth he had tried so hard to avoid. "I don't even know why I did it," Monette said, his voice a whisper now. "Maybe it was because I felt something slipping away between us. Maybe I was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Or maybe I was just weak, too weak to resist the temptation. But whatever the reason, I betrayed her just as much as she betrayed me." The road ahead twisted sharply, and Monette gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, seeping into the car, into his mind, clouding his thoughts. He could barely see the road now, the world reduced to a narrow strip of asphalt surrounded by an endless sea of gray. "I wanted to tell her," Monette confessed, his voice shaking. "I wanted to come clean, to beg for her forgiveness. But I couldn't. I was too much of a coward. I thought if I buried it deep enough, I could forget. But it's always been there, lurking in the back of my mind, a dark stain I couldn't wash away." The hitchhiker's silence was unbearable, a void that sucked the air out of the car. Monette could feel the man's eyes on him now, piercing through the fog, through the darkness, seeing every lie, every deceit, every weakness. The car seemed to move through the fog on its own, the road winding and twisting, as if leading them deeper into some hidden, shadowy realm. "I've ruined everything," Monette said, his voice barely audible. "I destroyed our marriage long before Elena's affair, and now I don't know if I can ever make things right." The silence that followed was suffocating, a crushing weight that pressed down on Monette's chest. He could feel his heart pounding, the guilt and shame coursing through him like poison. The road ahead was a blur, the fog so thick it felt like driving through a nightmare. And still, the hitchhiker said nothing. His presence was a silent, suffocating force that seemed to pull the truth from Monette, forcing him to confront the darkness within himself. The car continued its slow crawl through the fog, the world outside lost in the swirling gray mist. Monette's confession hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the man he had become. The silence was more than just the absence of sound. It was a mirror, reflecting back all the lies and betrayals, all the mistakes and regrets that had led him to this moment. And in that silence, Monette began to realize that the hitchhiker's silence was not just unsettling, it was terrifying. Because in that silence, Monette saw himself for who he truly was, a man who had lost everything, not because of Elena's betrayal, but because of his own. Chapter 4: The Revelation. The fog thinned as the car crept up to the gas station, its outline materializing like a specter through the mist. The building was a skeleton of its former self, a forgotten relic from another time. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing the weathered wood beneath. The sign above the station flickered weakly, its light barely cutting through the gloom. The single pump stood alone, a sentinel in the dark, rusted and worn by years of neglect. Monette slowed the car to a stop, the engine's hum fading into the oppressive stillness that surrounded him. The world was quiet, too quiet. He could hear his own breathing, sharp and shallow, and the steady thump of his heartbeat in his ears. It was as if the night had swallowed every sound, leaving nothing but the hollow echo of silence. He glanced over at the passenger seat, expecting to see the hitchhiker's unsettling figure still seated beside him. But the seat was empty. Monette's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. The man was gone. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car shift as the hitchhiker exited. He had simply vanished. Panic surged through him, a cold wave that tightened his chest and made his hands tremble. He quickly got out of the car, the door creaking on its hinges as he stepped into the night. The air was heavy with moisture, the fog curling around his legs like fingers grasping at his ankles. He looked around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of the hitchhiker. But there was nothing. The station was abandoned, the windows dark and empty, the building itself appearing as if it might collapse under the weight of its own neglect. The pump stood silent, a relic of a forgotten era, and the road stretched out behind him, swallowed by the night. "Hello?" Monette called out, his voice thin and strained in the stillness. There was no answer, not even the rustle of leaves or the whisper of wind. The night was silent, an oppressive void that seemed to draw closer with every passing second. Monette's pulse quickened. He walked around the car, his eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no sign of the man he had picked up just hours ago. It was as if the hitchhiker had never existed, as if he had been nothing more than a figment of Monette's imagination. The thought unsettled him even more. Had he been alone this whole time? Was the hitchhiker merely a product of his own guilt-ridden mind, a hallucination born from the stress and torment of the past few days? Monette felt his grip on reality slipping, the line between what was real and what wasn't beginning to blur. As he stood there, a shadow among shadows, a movement caught his eye. He turned, his heart lurching in his chest. There, standing by the side of the road, was the hitchhiker. He was exactly as Monette had first seen him, tall, gaunt, and unnervingly still. The fog curled around him, the mist clinging to his form like a shroud. His eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light, and his face was devoid of any emotion. Monette froze, his breath caught in his throat. The man's silence was more menacing now, the quiet so thick it pressed against Monette's skin, suffocating him. The hitchhiker's presence was no longer just unsettling, it was terrifying. There was something wrong, something deeply unnatural about the man. The hitchhiker didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Monette's presence in any way. He simply stood there, watching. Monette could feel the weight of that gaze, a cold, penetrating force that seemed to reach inside him, pulling at the darkest corners of his mind. It was as if the hitchhiker could see everything, every secret, every sin, every hidden thought Monette had ever buried. He took a step back, the gravel crunching underfoot, but the hitchhiker remained still. The silence was unbearable, a void that stretched endlessly, suffocating Monette with its weight. He felt as though he were sinking into it, drowning in the quiet, the darkness closing in around him. Monette wanted to speak, to break the silence that clung to the air like a thick fog, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mouth unable to form the sounds that might shatter the oppressive stillness. He was trapped in the quiet, held captive by the hitchhiker's unyielding gaze. Then, slowly, the hitchhiker began to move. His steps were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he walked towards Monette. Each footfall was soundless, swallowed by the thick fog that swirled around him. Monette's breath quickened, his fear spiking as the man approached. He wanted to run, to get back in the car and speed away, but his feet were rooted to the ground, his body paralyzed by a fear that reached deep into his soul. As the hitchhiker drew nearer, Monette felt the silence pressing down on him, invading his mind. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a living, breathing thing, a malevolent force that fed off his fear and guilt, growing stronger with each passing second. The hitchhiker was more than just a man, he was the embodiment of the silence itself, a creature of the void that existed to consume everything Monette had tried to hide from himself. Monette could feel his sanity slipping, the thin threads that held his mind together unraveling. The silence was tearing him apart, exposing every dark thought, every hidden sin, leaving him raw and vulnerable. The hitchhiker was inside his head, a presence that fed off his darkest fears and regrets, amplifying them until they were all Monette could hear, all he could feel. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the hitchhiker stopped. He stood just a few feet from Monette, his dark eyes boring into him, seeing everything. The silence was deafening, a scream that echoed in the back of Monette's mind, driving him to the brink of madness. Monette opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead, but the words died in his throat. The hitchhiker's gaze held him captive, his silence a weapon that sliced through Monette's soul, leaving him exposed and bleeding. And in that moment, Monette realized the truth, a truth that shattered him to his core. The hitchhiker wasn't just a figment of his imagination, nor was he a man in the conventional sense. He was something far worse, far more terrifying. He was the silence that Monette had feared his entire life, the silence that had been born from his betrayals, his sins, his guilt. and there would be no escaping it. Chapter 5: The Confrontation. The road snaked through the heart of the woods, the trees on either side standing like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, interlocking above the narrow path, forming a canopy that shut out the moonlight. Monette's car crawled forward, the headlights barely piercing the thick gloom. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that seemed to seep into Monette's very bones. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, sweat slicking his palms. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmarish reality he found himself trapped in. The hitchhiker's presence was a palpable weight beside him, even though the man wasn't physically there. Monette could feel him, his silence, his darkness, filling the car like a suffocating fog. As the car rounded a sharp bend, Monette slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a screeching halt. The road ahead was swallowed by the trees, and in that moment, Monette realized he could drive no further. He was trapped not by the woods, but by something far more insidious, the darkness within himself, a darkness that the hitchhiker had forced him to confront. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he turned in his seat, expecting to find the hitchhiker gone once more. But this time, the man was still there, seated in the passenger seat, his form barely visible in the dim light. His presence was a black hole, absorbing everything around him: light, sound, hope. Monette's fear boiled over into anger, a desperate rage that he clung to as his last defense against the madness threatening to consume him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mix of fury and terror. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, the hitchhiker said nothing, his silence more oppressive than ever. Monette's hands trembled on the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for a response that seemed like it would never come. Then, finally, the hitchhiker turned his head slowly to face Monette. When he spoke, his voice was a distorted echo, hollow and twisted, as if it came from the depths of a long-forgotten abyss. It was Monette's own voice, but warped and broken, stripped of all humanity. "I am you," the hitchhiker intoned, each word dragging through the air like a rusty blade. "I am the darkness you created, the silence you chose." Monette recoiled as if struck, the blood draining from his face. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "You're lying." The hitchhiker's eyes, dark and fathomless, bore into him, leaving no room for escape. "You've spent your life running from the truth, Monette. You buried your guilt, your shame, your sins in the silence, thinking you could outrun them, but they've always been with you, festering in the dark. I am that darkness." Monette's mind reeled, a torrent of memories and emotions flooding his senses. He had tried to keep his secrets hidden, to silence the voice of his conscience that had screamed at him for so long. He had betrayed Alina, and in doing so, he had betrayed himself. He had chosen silence over confession, darkness over light, thinking he could bury his sins deep enough that they would never resurface. But now, the hitchhiker was forcing him to confront what he had tried so desperately to forget. The man's silence, his unsettling presence, was the physical manifestation of everything Monette had feared. The emotional void he had created through his betrayals, the guilt that had gnawed at his soul, the darkness he had allowed to fester inside him. Monette shook his head again, his denial crumbling under the weight of the hitchhiker's words. "What do you want from me?" he pleaded, his voice breaking. The hitchhiker's lips curled into a grim, joyless smile. "I want you to face what you've done. You cannot hide from yourself, Monette. You cannot escape the silence you've created. It's time to confront the darkness, to embrace the truth you've buried for so long." Monette felt the walls of his carefully constructed life collapsing around him. He had spent years hiding behind a mask of success, pretending that he was in control, that his sins were nothing more than distant memories. But the hitchhiker had torn that mask away, exposing the raw, festering wound beneath. Tears welled up in Monette's eyes, blurring his vision as he realized there was no way out. He had been running for so long, but he had been running in circles, trapped in a prison of his own making. The hitchhiker, his own guilt, his own darkness, was here to ensure he could never run again. "I'm sorry," Monette whispered, the words choking in his throat. "I'm so sorry." The hitchhiker's gaze softened, but only slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of Monette's confession. "Sorry isn't enough, Monette," he said, his voice still echoing with that eerie, distorted quality. "You must face what you've done. Only then can you find redemption." Monette's breath hitched as the truth of the hitchhiker's words sank in. He couldn't hide from the darkness any longer. He had to confront it, to atone for his sins, to find a way to silence the guilt that had haunted him for so long. With trembling hands, Monette reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, but he welcomed it. He stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The hitchhiker remained seated, watching Monette with those dark, knowing eyes. "This is your journey, Monette," he said quietly. "You must walk it alone." Monette nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He turned and began to walk down the road, the trees closing in around him, the darkness swallowing him whole. But this time he wasn't running. He was confronting the silence, the darkness, the guilt that had consumed him for so long. And in the stillness of the night, Monette could almost hear the first whispers of redemption. Chapter 6. The Redemption. Monette's car sputtered and coughed, then died completely. The dashboard lights flickered before fading to black, leaving him stranded in the murky woods. He stared at the lifeless vehicle, a twisted sense of inevitability settling in his gut. He stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. The fog was thick, rolling in waves across the road, swallowing the world around him. Before him, barely visible through the mist, stood an ancient church. Its spire jutted into the night, crooked and crumbling, like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. The building was a relic, long abandoned, its wooden frame rotting, shingles hanging loose like broken teeth. The windows were dark, yet Monette felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him from within. Drawn by a force he couldn't resist, Monette trudged toward the church, his heart pounding in his chest. The heavy door creaked ominously as he pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty nave. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of mildew strong enough to choke on. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the altar, once grand, now sagged under the weight of neglect. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw her, Elena. She stood at the front of the church, bathed in the faint light filtering through the cracked stained glass. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed with grief, and something deeper, knowledge. Monette's breath caught in his throat as their gazes locked, the unspoken truths hanging between them like a noose. "Elena." His voice was a raspy whisper, the words clinging to the damp air. She didn't respond, didn't move. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, her silence more damning than any accusation. Monette felt his knees weaken, the weight of his sins pressing down on him like an iron shroud. "I know," Elena finally said, her voice cold, devoid of emotion. "I know everything." The words hit him like a blow, each one a sharpened knife slicing through his defenses. She knew about the affairs, the lies, the deceit. She knew, and yet she was still here, waiting for him in this forsaken place where the walls seemed to whisper his guilt. Monette opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His thoughts were a tangled mess, guilt and shame warring within him. He had come here, to this church, in search of something, absolution perhaps. But now, faced with the embodiment of his sins, he realized that words were useless. There could be no forgiveness, no redemption, unless he laid bare the darkness festering in his soul. "I betrayed you," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." Tears welled in his eyes, but he fought them back, determined to face the truth of his actions. I thought I could hide it, bury it deep where it wouldn't touch us. But it's poisoned everything. I've poisoned everything." As the confession spilled from his lips, the hitchhiker reappeared, materializing like a shadow out of the darkness. He stood at the far end of the church, silent as ever, his presence a specter of Monette's guilt. The hitchhiker's eyes gleamed with something akin to satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment, feeding off Monette's torment. Monette's gaze flicked between Elena and the hitchhiker, his heart pounding in his chest. The realization struck him with a cold, hard clarity. This was the crossroads. The hitchhiker was the embodiment of his sins, his silence a reflection of Monette's refusal to confront his own darkness. To silence the hitchhiker, to free himself from the suffocating guilt, there was only one path forward. "Elena, please," Monette pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. "I need your forgiveness. I can't live with this weight anymore. I know I don't deserve it, but please." For a long moment, the church was filled with nothing but the sound of Monette's ragged breathing, his plea hanging in the air. Then, Elena's face softened, the hardness in her eyes giving way to something resembling sorrow. "You've broken us, Monette," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I can't carry this hate anymore. It's killing me as much as it's killing you." She stepped toward him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Monette felt the icy grip of despair loosen its hold on his heart. He reached out, taking her hand, the warmth of her touch a lifeline in the storm of his guilt. As their fingers intertwined, Monette glanced over at the hitchhiker. The figure had begun to fade, the edges of his form blurring as if he were dissolving into the very air. Monette's breath caught in his throat. Could it be? Was this it? Had he finally found a way to silence the relentless ghost that had haunted him? But as the hitchhiker disappeared completely, leaving only the dim, dust-choked light in his place, Monette couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet he had hoped for, but a deeper, more sinister void. Together, Monette and Elena left the church, stepping out into the night. The fog had thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. Monette felt a strange calm settle over him, a sense of finality, as if the worst was behind him. He had confessed, he had sought atonement, and he had been granted a chance at redemption. But as they reached the car, and Monette slid behind the wheel, something cold and sharp twisted in his gut. He shook it off, attributing it to the remnants of fear, the lingering effects of the night's terrors. They drove in silence, the woods closing in around them once more, the road a narrow ribbon of asphalt stretching into the unknown. Monette felt Elena's presence beside him, her hand still clasped in his, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to hope. But then, as his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his heart froze. There, in the back seat, sat the hitchhiker, his form as solid and oppressive as it had ever been. His gaze met Monette's through the mirror, and though the hitchhiker said nothing, his silence spoke volumes. The calm that had settled over Monette evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that seeped into his bones. He realized, with a sinking heart, that the hitchhiker would never truly leave him. The silence he had created, the darkness he had fed, would always be with him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. As they drove deeper into the night, Monette gripped the wheel tighter, the realization settling over him like a shroud. There was no escape from the silence, no true redemption. The hitchhiker's presence was a reminder that some sins, once committed, could never be undone, and the weight of his guilt would follow him to the end of his days. And in the oppressive stillness of the night, the silence was louder than ever.